So welcome everyone to the virtual Eastside Freedom Library. I'm Peter Ratcliffe, the co-executive director. We are doing a series of programs this month dealing with race and class and their intersections. I want to just mention that tomorrow night we will be screening the film Finally Got the News about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. That'll be on our Facebook and YouTube pages. And Tuesday night, we'll be having a conversation with historian Jordan Camp, who has a new book called Incarcerating the Crisis, which includes a chapter on Detroit in the 60s and 70s and the rise of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. So please visit the Freedom Library's website to learn more about upcoming events. And we look forward to having a great event tonight and seeing you at other events. I want to turn things over to my colleague, Robin Priestley, from our partner, the Ramsey County Historical Society, with whom we've been doing these monthly History Revealed programs. Robin.
Thank you, Peter. We're really looking forward to tonight's program. And I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. We've been partners with the Eastside Freedom Library for 3 years now, and it's always exciting to participate in these programs. We are working on programs for the rest of this year. So as Peter mentioned, check out the Eastside Freedom Library's website, as well as the RCHS website. Those are on the slide on your screen. And while you're looking at our website, please consider supporting both organizations. We rely on the support of our members and our friends like you to continue to present these programs and all of our other efforts. And there are some great benefits to joining, including our quarterly magazine and just helping out get the word about history in Ramsey County and all the great things Eastside Freedom Library does for preservation of history, as well as with our CHS. I want to urge you all to also check out Subtext Books website. They are our book partner for the series of History Revealed talks. They are in downtown St. Paul, and they have the books on their website. So feel free to go there and check out tonight's book as well as other upcoming books. So the Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community. And we are so pleased to bring you tonight's program. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter to introduce tonight's speakers. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you to our speakers. And thank you, Peter, for setting this up.
Thank you, Robin. It's really a special treat tonight to have David Roediger with us. Many of us know David because he was part of this community for a long time. Others of us are familiar with his work. The Wages of Whiteness really made a tremendous difference in the way labor historians and American historians wrestled with the intersections of race and class. There are so many things about David that I've found remarkable, but one that I just want to say is that when everyone made a big fuss about what a breakthrough the Wages of Whiteness was, David went and did a new book in which he collected essays by 50 African-American authors who had written about whiteness before he had. And he put out this book, Black on White, to say that whiteness was not an original concept of his. And that kind of generosity and honesty has really been a hallmark of David's work now for more than 3 decades. So it's great that he's with us. He's in the throes of a union battle at the University of Kansas, where the administration is trying to get rid of tenure, which is provoking an organizing drive among faculty. Please follow that and weigh in and show support in whatever ways you can. What we try to do with our book events at the Eastside Freedom Library is to line up 2, 3, 4 people to read the book that's being focused on that evening. Ask them to read the book and engage publicly with the author before we go to the audience for comments and questions. It was pretty easy to find 3 people who were willing to read The Sinking Middle Class and talk with David. We're excited to have these folks together with us tonight. One is our old friend, August Nimps, a professor of political science and African-American studies at the U, and a longtime activist, not only in the Twin Cities, but really in the world. It's great to have August with us. Kieran Knutson is the newly elected president of CWA Local 7250, the local that represents workers at AT&T here in Minnesota. And Kieran has been a longtime activist for both class and racial justice here in the Twin Cities. And our third reader and discussant tonight is a newcomer to town, Megan Brown. I don't quite know how a labor geographer has found her way to Minnesota in time for what's about to be the coldest cold snap in decades. So I'm sure it's something that she'll share with her friends. But Megan came here to join the MAPPLE program, the master's program in advocacy and public policy and leadership at Metro State University. And we're delighted that she's with us tonight as well. So the plan is David's going to say a little bit about the book. August, Kieran, and Megan are going to offer some thoughts. David gets an opportunity to respond. If there's any crosstalk that the panelists are interested in, we'll have a few minutes for that. And then we will ask audience members to use the chat function on the Zoom, or if you're looking at this through Facebook, the comment function on the Facebook page, to type in your comments and questions, and Robin and I will track those and cluster them in hopefully productive ways and bring them to David and to the panelists. So that's the plan. So let me turn the microphone over to David and let him get us started. You're muted, David.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm really excited about this. I miss the Twin Cities. I don't miss the polar vortexes. So this is ideal to be there virtually on this week. I want to say that the Eastside Freedom Library is one of my favorite places, and I hope that people support it lavishly. I want to thank Robin and Carla as well as Peter. And I want to say how pleased I am to be on this panel, which includes old friends, role models for my kids, and in Megan, a new friend. To summarize the Sinking Middle Class, I'm going to pretend that it has 4 sections or themes. And one of the 4 I'll just mention and not develop at all. And that one is that the Marxist tradition of scholarship plays such an important role in considering how we conceptualize the middle class and how we think about the history of the middle class. And I think it's important to at least say that, because so often Marxism is regarded as sort of discredited by its inability to explain the staying power of the US middle class. But in fact, from Germany and the Frankfurt School, from even the later writings of Marx, and in the US, Louis Corey and C. Wright Mills and Barbara Ehrenreich and John Ehrenreich and Eric Olin Wright, one person after another who has real purchase on understanding the history of the middle class comes from the Marxist tradition. So the 3 I am going to talk about, I think I get to those best by explaining a little bit about where this book comes from and how long it was in the making. And its origins go back really to the time in the 90s when I was in St. Paul and Minneapolis, teaching at University of Minnesota. And I began to think, often in conversation with some of you, about two things. One was the ways in which unions, and especially leaders of unions, were coming to describe themselves and their movement as middle class rather than as working class, which was an accumulating thing, but was strikingly apparent by the 90s. And the second one related was the extent to which the Democratic Party under Clinton could present itself as the party of labor and of African Americans without offering hardly anything concrete to either group, and the ways in which kind of a vague appeal to quote unquote saving the middle class underpinned that emptiness of rhetoric. So I wrote a couple articles in the 90s about this, one in New Left Review, and collected material on how central the term middle class was to the project of the New Democrats under Clinton, and increasingly to Republicans. But I kind of put that aside, and I really didn't pick it back up until the 2008 Obama election, which set new records for the ways in which middle class proliferated in political discourse. And then by 2012, in the Romney-Obama race, both candidates sort of only talked about their competitive claims to being the candidate of the middle class. And they both had exactly the same definition of what the middle class was. They both said anybody who makes less than $250,000 a year is middle class. So all the poor were middle class in that formulation. So in that kind of long thinking, finally in 2010, I signed a contract to do this book on saving the middle class. And then it took me still another 9 years to write it, and I kept putting it aside for other books. It was a hard book to write. Kieran suggested he's not really very interested in the middle class today in a post, and I think that plagued me a little bit too at times, but it kept seeming important. And so I want to talk about the three themes then that run through it. The first is that stemming from the desire to understand the dramatic rightward shift in politics and political language in the 90s and the role of appeals to the middle class in that shift, I became very interested and wrote a long early chapter on the political scientist Stanley Greenberg. Now, Greenberg was briefly a Marxist. He was a professor at Yale, and then he went into the political consultancy business for various Democrats, first in Connecticut and then nationally. And he was hired in the 1980s by the UAW and the Democratic Party of Michigan to figure out what it was that was making working people, mostly white men, who had been loyal Democrats, who remembered the New Deal fondly maybe, all of a sudden they were turning up as Reagan voters. So these so-called Reagan Democrats became the object of Greenberg's consultancy. And he did this by taking the Democrats and UAW money and going to Macomb County, Michigan, outside of Detroit, suburb, almost entirely white, heavily unionized. And he declared Macomb County to be the very essence of what he was going to call middle class. That is white middle class. He didn't have to say that, but the county was white. He sometimes implied that he was also studying the white working class, that these were the same things, but he chose to use the term middle class. And he thought that it was particularly a seat of the virtues of this class, and in some ways the wisdom of this class and the hardworkingness of this class. And if you could reach voters in that county, you could figure out how to get these Reagan Democrats back into the Democratic Party. So in a time of NAFTA and reaction, very little in the way of actual, even palliative pro-worker reforms were on the table. And Greenberg, instead of thinking about what those reforms would look like, encouraged the Democrats to figure a different way. He convened focus groups that were all white, mostly male, and never met in integrated union halls or workplaces. So they were all white spaces, and they really amounted more to white encounter groups than they did to as much as they did to polling, sites of polling. He concluded that the middle class workers were irredeemably racist and could be won back only by listening to their calls for curbing affirmative action, stopping integration of schools, increasing incarceration and the death penalty, and ending welfare as it then existed. The Greenberg prescription languished briefly until Bill Clinton made it the Bible of his long shot 1992 campaign. Greenberg's triumphal book on Macomb County and the Clinton victory was called Middle Class Dreams. So this appeal to saving the middle class is also a strategy for not making any concrete, for curbing Black demands and for not taking up any serious working class demands. The second theme in the book, and I'm a historian, is that because of that, I had to know if it was really true, as chambers of commerce tell us, that the United States has always and everywhere been a middle class nation, and that that's a key to its glory. What I found was that in fact, through 1920s, the use of middle class was very rare in US publications. And interestingly, when it was used, it came largely in articles describing the middle classes of various European places. So the middle class, as Marx talked about it, was an object of interest to the United States population, but not used to describe United Statesians very much. Now, we could say that all those farmers and small businessmen of the 19th century were, quote unquote, really middle class in the 1800s. They just didn't know it. But then the difference between them, independent farmers and businessmen, and the employed secretaries, bookkeepers, and salespeople and technicians of the 20th century looms large. And it becomes clear that we're not talking about any coherent, continuous class presence in US history. The 30s and the Depression brought a jump in usage of middle class, particularly in pro-capitalist publications like Fortune. But the golden days of the US self-description as middle class came during the Cold War, when it was used to argue for the superiority of US systems of suburban consumption and gender relations over those of the Soviet Union. If you're as old as I am, you kind of vaguely remember the kitchen debate between Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev, in which they got into it in a model kitchen in the Soviet Union. And Nixon used that kitchen to declare how superior the juicers and self-cleaning ovens of the United States were. And Khrushchev argued for cafeterias and ending housework. When the Cold War ended, use of middle class dwindled in the United States, except, and I've suggested this before, in politics, where the Clinton and then Obama and forward usage made it the dominant political terminology, almost completely elbowing out considerations of the poor, for example. Nor, of course, is the United States a middle-class nation by virtue of treating those with the middle layers of income well and of seeing their wealth fare positively in the United States. US median wealth ranks far down the list of so-called developed nations. It's about 20th in that regard. It's a wealthy nation, but also a highly unequal one that doesn't provide for its middle in any kind of a special way. Lastly, thirdly, and very foreshortened, writing the book changed my opinion somewhat about the line between the working class and the middle classes. In the beginning, I held the traditional labor left position that polls showing 80% or more United Statesians identifying as middle class are overcooked, and pointed out that the working class, when the working class is offered a choice, when people are offered working class as a choice in those polls, the split becomes much more even, and many more people acknowledge that they're a working class rather than middle class. I still think that's a point worth making, though it is in struggles and not in nouns that we're going to get out of this mess. But I think it's worth pointing out to people that they have working class jobs, they have working class incomes, they're bossed as if they're working class people. And we still have, even in any poll, 30% of working class people do identify as middle class in this country. However, I also came to think in researching that lots of people seeing themselves as working class also see themselves as middle class situationally, and so that there's not an absolute line between those identities. And that when they call themselves middle class, they do so not out of a sense of claiming to be situated in a good life, are not only out of fearing falling out of that good life, but also out of a sense of common misery that defines the middle class experience as well as the working class experience in the United States. And I focus then on a particular set of middle class sadnesses that I think help us to explain why some working class people some of the time identify as middle class. So middle class miseries, which over time have extended to many working class jobs, involve installment debt, overwork, alienated labor involving having one's personality and appearance judged by bosses, and dissatisfactions associated with empty, indebted consumption. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, David. August,
Good. Am I on?
you are on.
Okay. First, I want to thank Peter and Carla and the rest of the library crew for inviting me to be a part of this program. It's really fun to reconnect with David and Karen, and to meet for the first time Megan. This is really a rich book, and the problem for me was where to plug into. There's so much going on in the book itself, so it was a real opportunity, a real learning moment for me, and to see an old acquaintance, Bill Onash, his voice appear was really a joy. When I first came around the Socialist Workers Party in 1972, the first class I ever attended was led by Bill Onash, and Bill was always very clear, and what you quote, Dave, in the book is exemplary of giving my best. So yeah, there's a lot going on here, and I don't think I have any disagreements with what Dave lays out, and I have questions and perhaps suggestions. But let me begin with a couple of factoids which I think are relevant to the book about developments that are taking place at this moment. On Friday, PBS NewsHour published a factoid after one of its reports. 40% of those arrested at the Capitol, that is the insurgents to break in, 40% of those arrested are business owners or hold quote unquote white collar jobs, unquote. And then yesterday, I think yesterday, a day before yesterday, the Washington Post wrote, had an article, 60% of the Capitol riot defendants, quote, had troubled financial past, including bankruptcy, debt, and unpaid taxes, unquote. Both of those factors, I think, are very relevant to David's argument. I don't want to get into it here. Maybe we can take it up during the discussion. Yeah, as I said, there was a lot going on here, brought to my mind all kinds of questions, thinking about COVID-19, what impact will COVID have in terms of the workplace? Will this deepen this divide, middle class illusions, that is some workers are able to work from home as opposed to others, the distinction between so-called essential workers and those who are more privileged to be able to work at home. Is something that came immediately to mind. Greenberg, yes, I always wondered whatever happened to Greenberg. I used to use his textbook in one of my courses for a number of years, and I was always curious about what happened to him. So to read about his trajectory was really interesting. American exceptionalism. To think that Stalin could have been the author of this concept was really quite interesting. But I was curious, though. It seems to me, even though he may have been the author, doesn't the idea, the substance exist prior to Stalin? It seems to me isn't there a case to be made that there was something unique about the United States and might not have Tocqueville be brought into that discussion around about the US. And it seems to me that was the case with Marx and his writings, the young Marx especially, but even the mature Marx, that in that letter in which he praises Abraham Lincoln about the Emancipation Proclamation, it seems to me in that praise, there's a lot about something unique that's taking place in the United States. So Engels in 1893 trying to explain why is there no Labor Party in the United States, and which I suspect was the inspiration for Sombart's book. Or Lenin's letter to American workers in 1918, in which he talks about U.S. history. It seems to me implicit in that letter. So I'm curious was there something unique in your opinion about the U.S.? And I remember for Marx's colleagues and comrades who migrated to the United States, it was always a joke within the movement about people who were revolutionaries in Germany. They came to the United States. We never heard from them anymore. They got lost on the prairie. They became landowners and so on, became farmers and so on. And so it seems to me that there was something unique about the U.S. Experience that I think that might be taken into account. On Greenberg, and the question I guess I have is, why should we expect anything more from the Democratic Party? The question I had, why would Greenberg get a hearing for his perspective? And it seems to me, at least I've always interpreted the rightward turn of the Democratic Party in terms of political economy. And maybe it's too reductionist, but I plead guilty. I mean, I was curious about what you thought. It seems to me with the end of the post-World War II boom, beginning in the 70s, with the two recessions, 74, 75, 81, 82, Reaganism was a response to that. And it seems to me the need to squeeze the working class, the only way in which this crisis could be solved, goes a long way in explaining, at least for me, the rightward turn of the Democratic Party. A party, by the way, we must always remind ourselves, was founded to serve the interests of slave owners and their descendants. In other words, we shouldn't, I think, expect anything more from the Democrat Party. In many ways, it's going back to its default position of a divide and rule strategy that was crucial to maintaining the racial order in the United States. I too used to do, and I still do actually in my class, the survey that David talked about for about the last 20 years. And I do it sort of anonymously and ask students first to define what they mean by class and then to situate their families. And I use it as an opportunity to have the discussion about exactly what do we mean by class. And what I've noted is that since the Great Recession, I'm seeing more and more students are more conscious and identifying with the being part of the working class. And it seems to me that's very much related again to the political economy. And I'm just curious, where does political economy figure into your perspective? And then in that chapter 4, I think it was, where you go back to Marx and Engels, I was very pleased to see that, looking at the manifesto and looking at Marx and Engels grappling with the question of the middle. By the way, there's an interesting appendix in one of the Hal Draper volumes. I think it's volume 1 in the Hal Draper series, an appendix called The Myth of Marx and the Disappearing middle class. I think it could be of use to make as supporting your argument. But yes, I want to call your attention to make a plea for an underrepresented article writing of Marx and Engels in the so-called classical Marx and Engels, and that's the 1850 address of the central authority of the League to the Communist League itself. And it's a self-criticism. I think it's the perfect follow-up to the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels have criticized themselves for dissolving the Communist League into the broader democratic movement. And in that document, Marx and Engels grapple with this question of electoral politics. How should the working class participate in electoral politics? And almost every page, it's an 11-page document, independence, working class political action. And it seems to me that that's crucial in trying to grapple with this question of how does the working class participate, in other words, in electoral politics, in order to avoid the trap of the Democratic and the Republican parties. And it's in that document too that they grapple with the question of the lesser of two evils, the lesser evil, the wasted vote phenomenon. And think about it, isn't that a big issue in motivating many people on the left, ending up having to support the Democratic Party? So I want to make a pitch for that document, the 1850 address, as a way of dealing with this problem of the middle class itself and in the electoral process. Okay, I've gone on longer than I anticipated, but we can discuss this later.
Teach, August, teach. Thank you. Great. Megan, do you want to go next, please?
Yes, of course. Thanks. Yeah, August, thanks for everything that you just said. And David, thank you for writing this book. I was really appreciative of the fact that it was such a rich book and so accessible. And I think it's going to really help me clarify the kinds of conversations that I want to have about class with my students who have mostly come from working class backgrounds and have these experiential understandings of class that really conflict with a lot of things that they've been taught about how class operates and what they should aspire to. So I think that the book does a good job of breaking down a lot of the reasons for these contradictions. I'm glad that August brought up the recent hand-wringing about the class status of the Capitol Hill rioters, because that to me is one of these moments where you can really see the ways that people try to justify political action in very specific ways. And I was struck by the fact that it gives a little bit of credence to the argument that is in the book about the fact that middle class politics tends towards reaction as opposed to revolution. And I just think it was a really good example of that. But I think probably one of the most interesting parts of this book for me is the section on kind of these shared middle class miseries. And one of the things that kind of stuck out to me is there's this possibility for the so-called middle class to be reactionary. We can see that in various ways. But I think it's also the case, probably often more likely, that the middle class will just opt out of politics. And there's a section in the book that's talking so much about this cycle of seeking increasing income, but also needing to get more debt and being a better consumer. That is this endless cycle that traps middle class people into something that they can't get out of. And it's a cycle of stress and worry. And you see that really clearly when you realize that getting your student loan is essentially like the rite of passage into the middle class in our contemporary society. And what it brought up for me is actually this movement. It's called the FIRE movement. I'm going to put movement in quotations. I don't know if it's something that most people are familiar with, but it stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. It's this loose group of personal finance gurus who essentially argue that if you get a handle on the spending side of the equation, if you slash your expenses, if you save a lot, you can save enough relatively quickly to stop working. And this kind of, I was reminded of this because of this section about self-help and the importance of that to the shared miseries of middle-class life. But I think one of the interesting things about this particular movement, and it's the same with most self-help or personal finance schemes, is how individualized it is. And if you listen to these kinds of discussions, at the heart of this is a really poignant critique of capitalism as a poor way of structuring an individual's life, right? There's a lot of pain around the fact that you have to go to a job that you don't like and work for a boss who could fire you at any moment. But at the end of it, there's an individualized solution, which is just to, in this case, save. And there's not a corresponding critique of capitalism as a poor way to structure society. So I think that it shows both the fact that there's a potential for the middle class to be reactionary, and also the potential for this idea of the middle class to be one that's really atomizing and creates individuals who just kind of act for themselves. But I don't think that's all that's here. And the other part of the book that I found really interesting was the part that's discussing the political potential of teachers kind of as labor movement vanguards. And for me, watching the past 5-10 years, you see so many of the most exciting large-scale labor actions coming through teacher organizing. And I think that the teaching profession, the nursing profession, there are these two professions that kind of straddle that line that you mentioned between working class and middle class identification. And it's not lost on me that these two professions in particular are very feminized professions. And it just kind of struck me that, there are a lot of hints throughout the book that masculinity plays a really big role in defining working class politics. And I think it makes it sometimes difficult to see working class organization coming from women or predominantly female professions. And I really appreciated what you just said 5 minutes ago. It's in the struggles, it's not in the nouns that we're gonna get out of this. But I think it's really interesting to think about the extent to which things like gender or region or other things that complicate or add to this discussion of what working class politics is and what it can be. So I'm just going to leave it there because I can't wait to have a more open discussion. But thanks so much for this chance.
Thank you, Megan. Kieran Knutson, you're up.
Hey, what's up, everybody? I want to say thank you to everybody that worked to put this together. I was really excited when Peter invited me to be part of this panel. Been a fan of David Roediger's for some time. I remember reading Wages to Whiteness when I was still a teenager on a long Greyhound bus ride between Minneapolis and Detroit. And I still value that book quite a bit. But then I saw the title of this book and I thought, oh my God, this sounds dreary and boring. But I did make my way through it, and it's a well-written book. You're a good writer, David. I like the way that you're scholarly and thoughtful and challenging, but still write in a popular way that's accessible for those of us that are not embedded at the university. I think that's an important skill, so I appreciate that. I've long been frustrated with the labor movement's use of the middle class slogan, and I sort of chalked it up to the distance that the bureaucracy has from the working class, and just their lack of any kind of direction towards freedom for us. But I didn't quite understand how it had been really imposed on us. And to paraphrase Utah Phillips, the old wobbly folk singer, the labor movement's not dying, it's being killed, and those people killing it have names and addresses. So it was interesting to find out about this Greenberg character. and how influential his project was on sort of imposing those politics on the labor movement. And I think that not only did that identification with the middle class versus the working class, not only is it a strategic mistake for those of us that believe in a radical revolutionary labor movement, replacing this kind of identity group as a sort of a lobbying constituency versus a group of people that have the potential power in our hands, but it's also a really morally unjustifiable position, because what it does is it separates workers and more stable workers away from the poor, and tries to teach those workers that your interests are separate and distinct from poor people, and then to rally around that group of people seems to me to be morally reprehensible. And then what I hadn't quite crystallized is something that you mentioned too, that the throwing up of the save the middle class as a slogan is a real limitation on our horizons too. If we replace the struggle for human freedom with the idea of just, a mortgage and a car and a couple of weeks of vacation, it's a real limiting on what our movements are all about. And I hadn't really crystallized to me until reading, I think, one of the early chapters in your book about how that was a factor too. I think also in one of the later chapters, you talk about how under the Trump election, this new concept of the white working class is being used in somewhat the same way that the old slogan around the middle class was, as a way of trying to steer popular discussion towards these conservative and limited aspirations. And in this case, even really racist ones, more explicitly so maybe even than previous. I thought that some of your descriptions of the reality of middle class or so-called middle class life, the alienation and the debt, are really true. Although I find myself sometimes having a hard time having sympathy, because in my role as a steward and a union militant, we're often clashing with these folks who are like the low-level managers, who I think, again, to borrow from W.B. Du Bois, who I think talked about the psychological wages of whiteness, maybe there's a psychological wage of this middle-class management, where some of them really get off on punishing workers and having this sort of petty little power over them. So even though I realize that many of their lives are not so much different from those that we're fighting for and representing, I have sometimes trouble having any sympathy for them because of the role that they've sort of chosen to play. And it made me think a little bit about whether that identification between middle class and working class isn't just material, but also ideological. I also want to talk about that. August spent a bunch of time talking about Marx, so I'm gonna throw in a little Machno for y'all. I remember reading one of his essays where he was talking about the peasants in Ukraine. He's a Ukrainian revolutionary, and he was talking about how he felt that the communist classification of the different peasant groups in Ukraine was off, that they had like 3 categories. And in fact, amongst Ukrainian peasants, they thought of about 5 or 7 different categories of peasants, and they kind of understood the culture that way. But from that, it made me think about inside the US working class, how there were almost distinct working classes. And my example that I'll go to is working at UPS. If you're working part-time, which is the majority of the workers in the warehouse, you're making, they're getting about 8 hours work out of you in 5 or 6 hours, and you're making a very little money. Most people who are part-time inside workers at UPS are poor. And you're loading trucks for guys who are also working a lot of hours, and their backs are bent by the time they retire, but they're making a ton of money and have a much different sort of life than the people working in the warehouse. And these are people that are in the same union, working for the same company, and yet almost in different social classes. And it made me think about those divisions. And I think one thing maybe the book doesn't deal enough with was, how did we as workers allow Greenberg and company to impose that on us, this idea of the middle class? And I think somewhat has to do with the real divisions that do exist within the working class. And of course, in this country, those are very racialized as well. I guess I'll just say finally that I do see some change happening in terms of what August mentioned, in terms of how people are identifying. And I think that is due to the struggles, like you said. It's not necessarily due to some new pollster or strategist that the Democrats have hired or something, although there's probably some people trying to cash in on it as we speak. But I think it is due to the struggles that have emerged, especially since Wisconsin, I'll say in 2011, followed by the Occupy movement, Idle No More, and of course the Black Lives Matter movements, and the great uprising in Minneapolis. So I think more and more people are starting to identify as working class, and I think that gives me some hope.
Thank you, Kieran. David, you want to take a few minutes to respond to some of what's been said?
Yeah, very few. I'm anxious to get to the Q&A and also to leave a little space if panelists want to respond to each other. One of the things that Kieran said that I thought was very important was the way that middle class encourages people to disavow the poor. And if you look even at Lyndon Johnson's terrible presidencies, he still, when he talked about class, overwhelmingly in his speeches that were about class, he talked about the poor. By the time you get to Obama in this, August, I completely agree with you about what we expect from Democrats. I'm just saying that, there are repackagings that end up being important and significant. So by the time you get to Obama, he almost never talks about the poor. And then when he's asked about it, he says, well, you say middle class, you're really talking about the poor because poor people all want to be middle class. And I think that there's a very famous passage on class by the Marxist historian and one of Peter's mentors, E.P. Thompson, right at the beginning of one of it, Making of the English Working Class. Thompson says, class is always a relationship. You can't have love without lovers, and you can't have class without squires and laborers, for the period he was talking about. And I think then when you insert middle class in there, it becomes very complicated because the middle class can look up and often does kind of very resentfully look up and some of those Capitol rioters that everybody talked about in one way or another have lots of resentments against liberal elites in particular, but they're also situated perfectly to look down and to find their enemies in the poor, and particularly in the racialized poor. And so maybe that goes a little bit into the situation that Greenberg exploited in Macomb County. Macomb County was about a third people who had fled Detroit by this time. It grew very fast. It was about a third people who couldn't stand Black power in Detroit and left after the Detroit Rebellion. And so when he got there was a very, very strong race-conscious reactionary base who regarded themselves as kind of driven out of Detroit with lots of resentments. So two things happen at once. One is NAFTA and capital flight, and the union being in a very difficult position of not knowing how to bargain in the face of those political economic changes that August alluded to. But then you also have the fact that in the 80s, when Greenberg went to Macomb County and did his research, the Rainbow Coalition was actually very strong in the Democratic Party, and there was some kind of self-assertion. And to some extent, people still remembered Black power in the UAW. And so these union officials and Democratic Party people were very willing to tap into kind of popular white resentment against African-American people. There's a terrible incident where Clinton goes and confronts Jesse Jackson at a Jackson meeting, and he picks a fight with Jackson about the fact that Sister Souljah performs at that meeting, and Clinton says Sister Souljah's a reverse racist that because of comments that she made in trying to explain the LA Rebellion. He makes this point. he makes this attack. And when Jackson was asked to comment on it, he says, I felt like Clinton came in there and he wasn't even talking to anybody who was in that room. And he was exactly right. He wasn't talking to any of the Black people at the meeting. He was talking to the white people in Macomb County. And we now know that the strategist who told Clinton to do that was Stanley Greenberg. So there are these cross-cuttings of race and class and the changing world economy and the position that labor leaders are left in not quite knowing how to respond to that, those changes in the world economy that I think kind of matter together. And then I just want to say one more thing that kind of reacts to Megan's excellent comments, that I think particularly the student loan one is so telling. And it's kind of an explanation for why still in classrooms, a lot of people overwhelmingly identify as middle class. If you're betting all of this student loan money that this is going to pay off, you're aspirational. You really have to be aspirationally middle class to make that commitment. But more than that, I wanted to respond to Megan's comment about teachers and the difficulties sometimes that we have in seeing teachers, first of all, as working class. Michael Zweig's great book on the working class majority only just very recently suggested that teachers and nurses might be working class people. And really by the time that they got into the working class in that view, they were already leaders of the working class movements in many ways. But during the Wisconsin uprising, which came up in a couple of the responses too, the strategy very quickly became electoral strategy demonstrations, but also aimed toward getting different politicians elected, and some of it worked and some of it didn't. But some people that I worked with we were suggesting that a counter strategy might be to reorganize Wisconsin and to say, okay, you Walker are going to do this. We're going to pour resources into this state to try to bring it back to the level to the time when it really was a union state, when the union density really was tremendous in Wisconsin. And I think that one reason that we didn't get any traction with that is that when we made that argument, it implied that teachers were going to be the leading edge of the labor movement. Were probably going to be. They were the most organized. They were the most under the gun. They were the most responsive. They were the most militant. And I think it is true that for what Megan suggested or gendered reasons, it was just hard. It was hard for some people on the left to get out of the imagination of the worker as the factory worker. And it was hard for people in labor leadership to think about largely women teachers playing that kind of role. And teachers in small towns would have had to have been a leading edge of something like that. But we paid pretty dearly for it, I think, in not trying to make that happen. So, and that's an example of many of those teachers would still also call themselves middle class in certain situations. It's not a matter of just of what they call themselves. It's a matter of what's being done to them and what they're being made into and the responses that they're making. So thanks everybody for all of your comments. And before Peter, back to questions, could we have a moment in which if people want to talk to each other, they can?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sure. August, Megan, Kieran, any further comments you want to make to each other or back to David?
Yeah, Megan's point about the crisis of capitalism and the need to critique capitalism, I think really has to be at the center of all of our discussions and so on, for progressive forces to be very clear about it. On the teachers, it seems to me though that the teachers, it's a contradictory side to it too. If you look at what's going on right now around COVID-19 and Chicago, and the question of should they be back in the classroom or not. And I thought the high watermark of the teacher struggles was West Virginia, not surprisingly. It began in West Virginia, in Mingo County, and it was able to fuse with the traditions of the labor movement there. And it was a real social movement. The only reason why they could organize every county, win in every county, is exactly because it was a social movement. They reached out to the families. They had to have the support of the communities. And all too often, in many teachers' struggles and so on, that's not present. And I really think what we're witnessing at this moment right now in Chicago is a divorce between the interests of the parents, the interests of the students, and so on, and the union. And it's really taking a beating. And related to that is what Kieran raised. And I'm just curious what David thought about. Reminiscent, it seems to be a little bit of what you're talking about, David. It reminds me of the AFL versus the CIO. That is the question of skilled trades, the attitudes of the skilled trades in relationship to the non-skilled worker. And this was a big fight, as you know, that had to be overcome, and it still exists in many parts of the workplace. And so I'm wondering if what you're describing is a particular subspecies of that larger problem of divide and rule, labor aristocracy, whatever you want to call it, the divisions within the labor movement.
Yeah. Kieran, you have anything you want to say? Megan? Years ago, when Jerry Tucker had the New Directions movement, I used to teach summer schools for him in St. Louis and for them. And I would ask workers, why would anybody want to be a white worker? And they were, probably 70% white workers came to those meetings, 30% workers of color. And I would just go in and not offer any talk. I'd just say, why would anybody want to be a white worker? And people, very unprompted, immediately answered. And it was almost always so-called white workers that answered. And they'd say, well, you can get a job in the skilled trades. You can, at that time, you can get a mortgage. You can live anywhere you want to. Your housing value is going to appreciate. You don't have to worry about police messing with you in the same way that, so this, and Kieran suggested this too, that these are very deep divisions within the working class that at one moment are about race, at another moment they're about skill, at another moment they're about wealth. If you take the middle 50%, the 25th to the 75th percentiles of wealth, and for Black people and white people in the United States, that white middle has about 10 or 11 times as much wealth as the Black middle has. So when a politician says to you, all we have to do is work on these middle class issues and all middle class people will rally around this, the middle is not in the same position all the time. It too is divided and structured in different divide and rule tactics, as August says. So I think that's important to realize.
Well, let me encourage people to start sending in comments and questions. And Robin and I will try to gather some up. There have been a couple already. And I want to grab one of them and sort of shape it a little bit. And that is our friend Mike Mitchell, who grew up in England and has come to live in Minnesota. Mike is raising questions about the difference in the way working class is used as a concept and an identity in the United States versus what he grew up with in Britain. And what I want to add to that is last night, those of us who were present for the conversation between Will Jones and Joe Trotter. Joe told a really, to my ears, remarkable story about attending a Pan-African conference in 1974 with a group of young African-American scholar activists, and being stunned by the way African activists in that moment were saying, you need to pay more attention to class. We're paying more attention to class. And so what I want to raise with Mike Mitchell's input and with the hangover of what Joe Trotter said last night is, how does this look, David, when we look transnationally? And August has raised the term of American exceptionalism. And I think sometimes we look at Trump and we say, well, Trump looks like the guy in Hungary and looks like the guy in Italy and looks certainly like the guy in Brazil. There seems to be a rise of the right transnationally. Is this shift in identity from working class to middle class something that we're seeing in other milieus as well as here in the United States? And how does that help us think about it here?
Yeah, one of the things that's really surprised me about this book is how much it's circulated in other countries, particularly in India and in Italy and in Britain. And in Britain, a lot of the debate was around the tail end of Brexit and around the kind of, is this the middle class? Is this the so-called white working class? And the best critiques of these kind of loose ideas about a white working class that were used to explain Trump's election in 2016, but had been gestated for a long time before that. The books all came out like 3 months after he was elected. They were already in the pipeline before the election. But so this it's really the British scholars, Lisa Tilley and Robbie Shilliam and some others who have compelling critiques of the incoherence of an idea of a white working class and the reason why white will always kind of become the dominant term once you go down that road and begin to try to make appeals to a white working class. But in Italy, I think that there's an attempt to kind of get beyond the categories of Occupy and to begin to think, if it's not the 99%, how do we want to think about the divisions in wealth in the society and where those lead? Mike Davis, I think, just wrote a little article about that. At best, we're trying to appeal to the 60%. That's what is really the hardcore of a left imaginary in the United States. And in India, there's a tremendous press around the idea that India is about to become a middle class country and to have the largest middle class. So,
Robin, yeah, go ahead, David.
No, that's all I have. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
So taking that a little farther, there was a question from Matt, who brings up the idea that without a notion of working class, how can U.S. workers ever hope to see themselves as part of something international, since middle class is so centered on our realities here in the U.S.? While this notion of working class may offer connections to others around the world, perhaps to those who have been exploited or attacked by U.S. imperialism. So if anybody wants to respond to that.
No, I think that's an important question. And one of the reasons why I raised this question of political economy, that is, it allows us to see understand the crisis exactly because it's a crisis of capitalism. It has to be an international crisis. And so it's not surprising that we see similar developments happening elsewhere, but not only in the working class. I'm reminded of the peasantry, the farmers, what's going on in India right now with these protests. And in fact, I just got a letter from someone asking for solidarity, and I sent it to someone who's active in the farm struggle over in Wisconsin. And farmers in Wisconsin would be family farmers are very interested and would be attracted to what's going on in India. So yeah, as we know, I think everybody knows from the very beginning of the modern communist movement, we realized it had to be international. And so that's one of the problems when we're looking at this middle class. One of the things interesting, David, I did with Ngram was to, it's a great tool. You can get seduced by it, I admit, but comparing working class and middle class together, and to look at the changes that have taken place over time. And one of the surprises to me was to see what's been going on in British English, where middle class now has surpassed working class, where for a long time, Britain was the opposite of the US. But now, and most recently, this term middle class has overtaken working class.
Let me jump in and read a question here directed to Kieran from Tarek. Oh, this is moved too fast for me here. Robin, do you see it?
Yes, I do. So this
Please.
is for you, Karen, from Tariq. It says, I noticed that when you ran in your union election, you did not attempt to appeal to middle class values, and middle class in quotes, but very explicitly appealed to a working class consciousness. And that was apparently a successful strategy. Do you see your workplace as exceptional? Or is it indicative of a larger shift in working class consciousness? And if so, what do you attribute that consciousness to?
Cool. Yeah, well, it was totally due to my brilliance as an organizer. No, I'm just kidding. I think a couple things. One, there's some particular areas about our industry and the realization about how vulnerable workers are from dropping from a relatively stable working class living wage union job to nothing because of the way telecom can get rid of jobs so quickly, move jobs so quickly, outsource so quickly. When we went out on a strike, grievance strike a few years back, they were able to shift the calls. It took them all day to do it, but by the end of the day, they shifted all the calls that we normally field to Nashville, to another CWA represented call center. And they didn't know why they were getting these extra calls. They might have figured it was a weather thing in Minnesota or something. But so we're particularly vulnerable, I think, and people have started to understand that with the number of job cuts that AT&T has done. And so I think they're looking for somebody to fight. They want to be a part of some kind of fight. But I do think that you can't separate it from what's going on wider in the society. And I think I remember when the Occupy movement was happening, and I agree with the limitations of the 99% analysis and all that. But at the time, it was a really it was an important moment, and the main Occupy space in Minneapolis was only a few blocks away from where we work. So a number of workers would go over there on their lunch break just to check it out, or might go past it on their way to the light rail or the bus after work. And it became a real talking point in our workplace. And, and then since then, I just think, I remember at one point in Minneapolis, after Jamar Clark was killed, and the police brutality movement that kept going here for a couple of years with Philando, that there was so many, almost every day the company would get some memo from downtown police about which streets were going to be blocked off that day. And I figured, I was like, this must be what it's like to live in France, right? Where there's like protests every day, and your life is always having to sort of deal with the fact that there's a permanent state of protest going on. And so I think all of these things add up to where people are at, and I think more and more people see less chance of through the normal systems that are out there, the official labor movement, the official political parties, and people are looking for something more.
Thank you, Kieran. That brings us, leads right into Howard's question, and we'll go back to a question that moved up the line. But Howard mentions that some of the difficulty of identifying with the working class is based on ignorance of history, of labor struggles, but our hard-fought struggles of working people, including strikes, the street fights, getting murdered, etc., the protests that you mentioned in France. While those are many efforts, what more can be done? And he talks about anti-communism gives cover to not use the term working class because it causes too much radical and becomes almost un-American.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I was at a conference once for a retiring working class historian, and I made a kind of an offhand comment about the official labor movement insisting on middle class and not on working class. And I didn't really have a follow-up for it. It was thrown out, and I was sorry I did it afterwards. And then a woman journalist came up who edited a state Fed's paper, already not a paper, but an online paper. And she was all excited, and she said, that's literally true. In my journalism, there's a search and replace mechanism that if someone says working class, it gets replaced as middle class. And in that particular state that she was talking about, I can imagine that it was both reflecting the way that Democratic politicians prefer to make appeals, but also kind of old-time anti-communism at the same time, that you just didn't say working class. One kind of not so bad byproduct of this is we've never had the term white working class have much of a currency in the United States either, because people were too afraid to say working class in the first place.
So what?
Yeah, go ahead, Robin, please.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Peter.
No.
I was going to say, Yvonne has a question or a comment, and to get your feedback. So what are your thoughts about if the U.S. working middle class, whatever ethnicity, do they realize what they are doing to the U.S. economy by purchasing from chain stores to primarily have products made anywhere but here in the U.S.? And he mentions that that's destroying the jobs that keep the middle class working. So if anybody has any thoughts on that. I'm going to circle back to a question that moved up in chat. There was a question, somebody would like some more information on Greenberg, what happened to him, and what his, and I've sort of lost the question now, and I apologize to the person who wrote the question, but some more information on his track.
Particularly that he had written about South Africa earlier
Yes.
in his career.
Yeah, he wrote a great, more or less Marxist comparative history, transnational history of Israel, the United States, South Africa, Brazil. But the meat of it was on South Africa, and he ended up going to South Africa and becoming an advisor to the ANC, later a pollster for Mandela. But his life really changed when he was denied tenure at Yale, part because of those movement activities, and in part because he got spied on by South African police and was overheard at a private talk advocating disinvestment from South Africa while he was still trying to work for the Ford Foundation, or with the Ford Foundation. So it's then that he turns more or less full time to this political consultancy. And because he has these ANC radical credentials and even Marxist credentials, he's somebody that the unions call up and say, oh, here's the guy who can talk about class. But and I think probably originally in the 80s, he thought that he was bringing class back into the Democratic Party. The way he did it was to take these white workers at their worst and kind of freeze them at their worst and not give them any opportunity to be talking about their concerns in integrated settings or talking about what would make their union power greater. And so his impact was exactly the opposite of that early South African history. He's still a big consultant, both in Democratic Party politics and for reactionary corporations like Monsanto and BP. He did the greenwashing of British Petroleum after the Gulf environmental disasters. And it was he who really laid the groundwork for this, helped lay the groundwork for this analysis of Trump as a product of the so-called white working class. So he's still very much a fixture in Democratic Party politics.
So we have a question here that's come in on the Facebook page from our old friend Nan Enstad. And she says she's glad that August has brought up the farmers in India who are now engaged in what people are saying is the largest movement in world history. I'm interested in how thinking about farm workers in the United States and globally could shift us out of old polarities of so-called post-Fordism. The problem of category is even greater here, with farm workers almost entirely invisible politically. How does that fit into the middle class, working class analysis that's being explored here?
Well, I don't know if I fully can answer the question. I know one of the things that in India, the regime has tried to paint these farmers as part of the equivalent of the labor aristocracy, if you want to call it that, the farm aristocracy, that is high-paid farmers. And so the Modi government is on a conscious process to try to carry out a divide and rule strategy, and also on the basis of religious differences and so on. So so I'm not sure I have an answer to the question other than the fact that some of the issues that farmers are experiencing are the same ones, the divide and rule problems within the farm movement. I was thinking earlier about the skilled trades versus the non-skilled trades, and within the farm workers movement, as some people know, that was a big issue around the question of immigrants and whether or not would the United Farm Workers take up the question of the fight of the undocumented, and that took them a long time to overcome their prejudices and so on to be able to deal with this question. So yes, I think the divisions, these real divisions, as Kieran pointed out, amongst the peasantry are real, and so these fights also have some of the same challenges at the working class. And then, of course, the worker peasant alliance. That was really the alliance that Marx and Engels fought for, an alliance with the middle classes, that is with property owners, small farmers. That was a part of the alliance. That is to forge an alliance between workers and peasants. And of course, Lenin would develop that idea to the most advanced. And so, we should never forget, just because the farmers constitute a small percentage of the population here in the United States, we should never ignore the farm workers movement.
So here's another question that's come in on Facebook. Curious about thinking the working class as a needed abolitionist force, calls for the expulsion of prison guards from the AFL-CIO, etc. are, to my mind, critical efforts in not only bringing specificity to various class categories in circulation, but also for challenging the horizon of rights, in quotes, rights in service of total liberation. Thoughts from anyone on those questions? I mean, I would just add, while maybe the panelists are thinking, you know, that when the calls started to come in the summer for kicking the police unions out of the AFL-CIO, and of course, some people discovered that they were not, in fact, in the AFL-CIO. But then we began to grapple with the reality that in a union like the Teamsters 320 locally, that the campus police at the University of Minnesota are in that union. AFSCME Council 5, that correctional officers are not only in the union, but a major political force within the union. And so grappling with where do cops and correctional officers fit, not just in the labor movement, but also in the working class, certainly has presented itself as a complicated question. And I wonder if any of the panelists have been thinking about that or have thoughts about that.
Well, no, go ahead, Karen.
Karen, please.
Sure. I'll just say I agree with the person making that question or putting that out there. I mean, I feel like any union that has, you know, a membership that includes people that are actively trying to police and hold down a section of the class is going to, you know, run into that contradiction. It's going to make them unable to move forward, I think, towards the kind of freedom movement that we need. You know, I just think that most people who live in Minneapolis have an understanding of the function of the Minneapolis police now. That's been the great things about this year, is this sort of mass education that happened. Of course, many people have known about it for their whole lives, but I feel like now there's a huge number of people in the city that have a real understanding about the role of the police. And so to put yourself in a situation where you're you're sharing a union with the people who are, you know, playing a role in holding you down just doesn't make any sense. So I think, like, you know, I think there's all these different initiatives we need to be supported, you know, and experimented with in terms of pushing that question forward. I support them all.
And
Go ahead, August.
yeah, I just want to underscore something that Kieran said earlier, which I think is related to this, and that is class consciousness is much more likely to come about when workers begin to struggle, when you go into motion and fight. And that's where you see this in the Enneagram, by the way. You could see how class, when people are using working class and when they're not using working class and so on, it's very much related to the big fights that are taking place. And so, yeah, I think the way workers will understand the police is when they go out on a picket line. That's when workers will understand about who the police are. In the absence of being on the picket line and in struggles, it could be a little bit more abstract. But once you get out there on the picket line, so then you begin to find out on whose side the police are. And so these people will have to make choices. If they want to be on the side of the working class, they can't be police.
Yeah, I would say that it is a complicated set of union issues, but it's not a very complicated moral question. I think the case for abolition as a moral case comes first, and now has political traction, and at least in Minneapolis. And I think it has to be fought in that way, and then the complicated parts can be more easily settled.
Here's one from Pablo, asking for more about thinking about the presence of migrant workers or second generation immigrants who've come from countries with significant traditions of working class organizing. What role are they playing, or can they play in this next stage of development of working class consciousness and organization in the United States?
I've already talked once, but I go again real quick. I'll just say that in Minneapolis, it's on, the impact of immigrant workers on the working class is unmistakable. And I think that it's impossible to imagine any kind of working class movement here without, the strong presence of Latino and East African workers in particular. And not just outside the unions, but actually inside the unions now as well. And yeah, I think that my kids grew up going to school with Latino and East African kids, playing soccer with them and stuff too. And it's just like a part of who my kids are, and I think that's true of lots of working class kids from African American and white families as well. Yeah, there's no working class movement without immigrants.
And I think we want to explain.
Go ahead, August.
I was just going to say, I think we want to explain to people that's been the history of the labor movement in the United States at its most noble moments, the role of immigrant workers. It's not something that's new.
Let me just play with that for a second. And David, a piece that you wrote with Jim Barrett some years ago about what you guys called in between peoples, about that second generation and whether it's the process of Americanization or socialization or what's happening. And I want to bring in some of what Megan said about, I don't think you exactly used the word individualism, but you talked about individuals and individuation. And one of the ways that I've thought about Americanization over the years is that immigrants come with a very strong collective ethos and set of practices and values. And part of what the American educational system and popular culture are trying to do to them over time is to drive them to be more individually oriented and more competitive rather than cooperative. And so I wonder if we take the longer view, I agree with Kieran about the current impact of and the current presence of immigrant workers in the working class and in the labor movement locally. And I agree with August that at high points in American labor history, we see a very diverse working class bonded together and acting together. But David, is there a way to see this as also tied to what's made the concept of middle class marketable to the working class in the United States? That people who have for many generations been bombarded with ideas of individualism and competitiveness, and that's then packaged as part of middle class. You're muted, David.
I have very loud cat activity here, so in connection with immigrants, I think the main point is the point that Kieran and August made. The very last thing I did in Minneapolis in the movement was the hotel workers strike in 2000, right?
99.
99, yeah. And that strike was a very good illustration of exactly the the fact that all of a sudden we realized that no, it wasn't 8 languages, it was 13 languages that documents had to be translated into. And it was just an incredible struggle, and an incredible struggle for moving some white workers in its proximity to Seattle, and some white workers really developed politically very much out of that struggle. So I think that's the main story. I do think that there's a way that, first of all, some immigrants are coming because they have skills and have relatively stable incomes and occupations, and that their kids are going to go to college. And so there's a sense in which they're in the middle class in the country that they left, and probably going to be in the middle class here. But I wouldn't say that that overrides the point that Karen made exactly.
And again, I think political economy is crucial. I really subscribe to the view that the best that capitalism has to offer the working class, that's behind us.
Mhm.
The best that capitalism has to working class, that's behind us. And so immigrants now are coming to a society where the American dream, if it ever existed, as George Carlin once said, the American dream is behind us. That's behind us. And so immigrants are compelled they're compelled to have to deal with this reality. May have come with all kinds of hopes and dreams and so on, but the opportunities are simply not there.
Mhm.
The opportunities are simply not there. And this is what will compel them to integrate and be a part of the fights that are taking place. Look at what's going on. Yeah, this fight at Amazon, and you go to Amazon, these distribution centers, you see the multinational character of these distribution centers. And so this is voted in Bessemer. Next month is going to be very important. I'm sure it's a very, very international, multiracial fight.
So we're at 8:30, and we should wrap up. I think our inclination is to allow some informal. We can shut down the recording unless any of the panelists have a last comment to make. Megan, I feel like we didn't give you much platform after your initial comments. And anything you want to add?
I'm afraid that what I would add would take us in a totally new direction. And I will leave the summative comments to someone else.
Well, that's very tempting. David, any?
Well, I just wanted to say how important I thought Megan's comment about fire was. Part of this book was going to be a little study of, I think his name is David Ramsey, the radio economist and preacher, who is not exactly that, but he's right on the edge of it. You pay back all your debt, you don't spend any money at all for 5 years, and then you're fine. And the miserableism of his show is just palpable. I mean, and the desperation of so many people that call in. So, and then I came to think and know that somebody else was working on it, and I decided that I didn't want to step into that territory, and I'm not sure that any studies of him have actually come out, but I think it's a really, really important barometer of how people are trying to solve collective problems with this extremely individual, often faith-based set of solutions.
So can we end on an optimistic note? The American dream is behind us, says Professor Nim.
I think he was
Kieran
implying
has
that
just been elected
socialism
president
away.
of his local. That's definitely a positive note. David?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're obviously in a very terrible historical moment in terms of COVID and the choices on offer in U.S. politics, and the kind of inability to produce any kind of a response to crises. But I don't think for those of us on the left that we have to say that. C.L.R. James once said that he had lived through Stalin and Hitler, and I think maybe he said Roosevelt, and he said, and all of those answers didn't solve anything that was the fundamental problem of the society. And so he looked forward to people getting together to try to solve that fundamental problem.
Great. Our best days are ahead.